How could this have happened? What was she doing up at Glacier Park? Why had her vehicle slid off the road? The heart monitor beeped softly and steadily, yet he wasn't reassured as he stared down at this stranger who was his half-sister. A dozen memories darted wildly through his mind, and though at one time, when she was first born, he'd been envious and resentful of his father's namesake, he'd never been able to really dislike her. Randi had been so outgoing and alive, her eyes sparkling with mischief, her laughter contagious, a girl who wore her heart on her sleeve, guileless and believing that she had every right to be the apple of her father's eye. Randi Penelope McCafferty had bulldozed her way through life and into almost anyone's heart she came across, including those of her reluctant hellions of half-brothers who had sworn while their new stepmother was pregnant that they would despise the baby who, as far as their tunnel-visioned young eyes could see, was the reason their own parents had divorced so bitterly. Now, 26 years later, Thorne cringed at his ill-focused hostility. He'd been 13 when his half-sister had summoned the gall to arrive, red-faced and screaming into this world. Thorne had been thoroughly disgusted at the thought of his father and the younger woman he'd married actually doing it and creating this love child. Worse yet was the scandal surrounding her birth date, barely 6 months after J. Randall's second nuptials. It had been too humiliating to think about, and he'd taken a lot of needling from his classmates who, having always been envious of the McCafferty name, wealth, and reputation, had found some dark humor in the situation. Hell, it had been a long time ago, and now, standing in the sterile hospital unit with patients barely clinging to life, his own sister hooked up to machines that helped her survive, Thorne felt a fool. All the mortification and shame Thorne had endured at Randi's conception and birth had disappeared from the first time he'd caught his first real glimpse of her little, innocent face. Staring into the fancy, lace-covered bassinet in the master bedroom at the ranch, Thorne had been ready to hate the baby on sight. After all, for 5 or 6 months, she'd been the source of all his anger and humiliation. But Thorne had been instantly taken with the little infant with her dark hair, bright eyes, and flailing fists. She'd looked as mad to be there as he'd felt that she'd disrupted his life. She'd wailed and cried and put up a fuss that couldn't be believed. The sound that had been emitted from her tiny voice box, like a wounded cougar, had bored right to the heart of him. He'd hidden his feelings, kept his fascination with the baby to himself, and made sure no one, least of all his brothers and father, knew how he really felt about the infant, that he'd been beguiled by her from the very beginning of her life. Now, as he watched her labored breathing and noticed the blood-encrusted bandages that were placed over her swollen face, he felt like a heel. He'd let her slip away from him, hadn't kept in touch because it hadn't been convenient for either of them, and now she lay helpless, the victim of an accident that hadn't yet been explained to him. "You can talk to her," a soft, feminine voice said to him, and he looked up to see Nicole looking at him with round, compassionate eyes. The color of aged whiskey and surrounded by thick lashes, they seemed to stare right into his very soul, as they had when he was 22, and she'd been barely 17. God, that seemed a lifetime ago. "No one knows if she can hear you or not, but it certainly wouldn't hurt." Her lips curved into a tender, encouraging smile, and though he felt like a fool, he nodded, surprised not only that she'd matured into a full-fledged woman, but that she was a doctor, no less, and one who could bark out orders or offer compassionate whispers with an equal amount of command. This was Nikki Sanders, the girl who had nearly roped his heart, the one girl who had nearly convinced him to stay in Grand Hope and scrape out a living on the ranch. Leaving her had been tough, but he'd done it. He'd had to. As if sensing he might need some privacy, she turned back to the chart on which she was taking notes. Thorne dragged his gaze from the curve of Nikki's neck, though he couldn't help but notice that one strand of gold-streaked hair fell from the knot she'd pinned at her crown. Maybe she wasn't so buttoned down.